Hey everyone, welcome back to my painting tutorial. My name is Jay and today I'll be showing you how to paint this Deathwing Terminator from the Dark Vengeance starter set. We just finished with giving all the reds a wash. The next step was to give all these areas then a highlight using Evil Sun's Scarlet, the associated first layer color with Mephiston Red. For this step, I used an overbrush technique on the scabbard and the rope, basically just dragging my brush perpendicular to the surface just to pick up the edges and the raised details. However, for the sword, I used a feathering technique and tried to build up a lighter gradient towards the end of the sword. For the gun, I basically just focused on all the areas that weren't edges or recesses, so I kept the edges and the recesses much darker, and built a gradient of Evil Sun Scarlet around the areas that you know that the light source would be hitting. As with the previous red step, this step took me a little bit of time as there were a lot of red areas on the model, and the importance is once again on uniformity, so make sure you have a very nice even coat of Evil Sun Scarlet before proceeding to the final highlight. As you'll probably notice, I am basically base coating, shading, and giving two highlights to each color other than the black area, since I'm trying to go for an above tabletop standard miniature. And finally, I did a second highlight of these red areas using Wildrider Red, which is actually more like a really dark orange. It's kind of in between orange and red. For the sword, once again, I tried to do a feathering technique and build up the brightness of the Wildrider Red towards the edge of the sword. For the gun, I basically just did an edge highlight of the gun and then did an overbrush of the rope and the scabbard, as well as the purity seals and the symbols on the shoulders. This highlight left some of the areas a little too bright for my taste, especially for a Deathwing. So to tie all these colors together and to bring down the red a little bit, I gave all the red areas a bloodletter glaze. Personally, I am a huge fan of the new glaze products. They are amazing at tying together colors and blending really well, especially if you're trying to get a gradient together like I was doing on the sword. Glazes are definitely the way to go. Just remember to use these glazes a little bit at a time until the desired darkness that you want. I then started on the greens, which was basically just the chest symbol with Caliban Green. Caliban Green is basically the equivalent to the old Dark Angels green, and so it's the perfect color to use when painting a Dark Angels Terminator. I found the Caliban Green to go on actually very thinly, as opposed to most of the base colors. So it was actually very nice to work with, and it went on very easily. So I decided to paint the feathers on his arm the same color of Caliban Green as well. I know usually I do a shading after a base coat, however, since the Caliban Green is already particularly dark, I skipped straight to the first highlight of Warpstone Glow, the first layer color associated with Caliban Green. And similar to my previous highlights, I basically just did an overbrush style once again with the Warpstone Glow and tried to pick up the edges of the wings and the feathers and tried to leave the Caliban Green in the recesses. Once that step was completed, I did a second highlight with Moot Green, the second layer color associated with Caliban Green. And I just tried to do an even lighter overbrush technique for this step and only pick up the very, very edges of the wings and the feathers. And like the previous step, to tie all these colors together, I did a Waywatcher green glaze, which will blend these colors together and produce some really awesome looking symbols and feathers. The interesting part about Waywatcher green is that it actually has a bit of a yellow tinge to it, so it tends to brighten some colors while blending these colors together. So it's very interesting. And as before, I recommend doing very, very thin layers of Weight Watcher green and building up to the darkness or brightness of the color you really want. And always make sure that the one glaze is dry before doing the next. I usually prefer my purity seals to be very light brown, but since they are almost a perfect match in color to the armor, I decided to give all of the purity seals an Agrax Earth shade and make them look really, really dark brown and shady. That way they'll really pop and you can notice them from a distance as opposed to them just blending into the armor. Once that step was complete, I started the quite long step of painting all the metallic pieces on the model with Lead Belcher base color. Lead Belcher does an excellent job of going over the bone base coat, so it tends to go on with a single coat and tends to go on quite quickly. However, there were just a lot of pieces of the model to be painted Lead Belcher. For example, the pieces of the gun that wasn't red, the parts of his sword, the symbol on his left shoulder, and the parts of his face such as the vents. And just to add a little bit more detail, I also decided to paint what I call them the bolts in the armor on the arms and the legs. It'll just add a little bit more contrast in the armor, some more color variation, and make these areas really pop. And one more thing to note, for the symbols on his knee and his shoulder pads, I tried to not fill in the armor areas between the metallic areas, which as you can see here, I'm just painting the symbol itself and not the area within the symbol. And as mentioned, I painted the vents and the bolts, as well as the symbol on his forehead, Lead Belcher as well. And just to add a little extra flair, I also painted that area, the very top of his forehead. That was kind of like a vent as well, just to, again, add a little more detail. As I'm trying to go above tabletop quality, these are always quick and easy ways to accomplish your task. And with this step nearing completion, we can turn our focus to washing and highlighting the metallic areas, as well as finishing all the other areas on the model, including the eyes and the golds.